We're going to move on now with Professor Jae Jung. Professor Jae Jung will be talking about the state of gifted education in Australia, a SWOT analysis. Jae Yup Jung, PhD, is a professor in the School of Education and the director of the Gifted Education Research, Resource and Information Center at the University of New South Wales, Australia. His research program, which incorporates various topics relating to gifted adolescents with a particular focus on their education and career-related decisions, has been published or presented in more than 100 occasions. He is currently the editor of the Australasian Journal of Gifted Education and the vice president of the Asia Pacific Federation on Giftedness. He's also the president of the Australian Association for the Education of the Gifted and Talented. So he comes holding many degrees and many titles, and we look forward to your wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Laila. And I'd also like to thank everyone we've met, all the members of the Executive Committee of the Asia Pacific Federation on Giftedness. We've been treated very well by the University of Business and Technology. We're delighted to be here, and we're delighted to share our knowledge about giftedness with you over the next couple of days. Okay, so today I'll be talking about the state of gifted education in Australia, a SWOT analysis, an analysis of the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. In this presentation, I'll first discuss the definition of giftedness that's followed in Australia, some of the prevailing attitudes toward giftedness and gifted education as found in the research, the history, a brief history of giftedness and gifted education, how gifted students are identified in Australia, some of the educational interventions that are offered, and also the legal frameworks under which gifted education is offered in Australia. Okay, first of all, the definition of giftedness. In Australia, most schools that offer gifted education, we follow the model developed by the French-Canadian scholar François Gagne's differentiated model of giftedness and talent. And I'll just give you an overview of this model. I know that there is no international consensus on a model of giftedness around the world. The model that does appear on the screen here, it divides.
So in this model of giftedness, the differentiated model of giftedness and talent. By the way, this is the 2009 version of the model. François Gagne has earlier versions and later versions. I'm showing you this version because this is the version that is widely adopted in Australia. It divides giftedness into 6 different domains. Basically, you can be intellectually gifted, creatively gifted, socially gifted, or physically gifted. You're gifted if you qualify as being the top 10% among your age peers in any of these domains. One's giftedness is, if you follow that screen at the back actually, one's giftedness is translated into talent. So giftedness is high-level ability, is translated into talent, high-level achievement. That places you in the top 10% among students of your age in multiple domains. There's a developmental process, schooling, formal schooling, informal schooling, etc. That translates giftedness into talent, high-level achievement, high-level ability into high-level achievement. And this is facilitated by intrapersonal and environmental factors. One's giftedness, high-level ability in one of these 6 domains is translated into talent or high-level achievements in any of these fields through a developmental process, which refers to schooling, formal schooling, informal schooling, things that one learns at home, etc. And this developmental process is influenced by environmental factors, the physical, cultural, social, familial environment that one is brought up in, the educational provisions that one is able to access, and also intrapersonal factors such as one's personality, one's physical, mental attributes, etc. So this is the model that is widely adopted in Australia. If I just go back to a previous slide, so in Australia, education is a state issue. Australia is divided into 6 states and 2 territories. There's not a mandate across the country. Every state, every territory can make its own decision. So every state, every territory has a separate gifted education policy document. Most of the states and territories in Australia do have one. The exceptions are Victoria and Queensland. I'm from the state of New South Wales, which has a pretty extensive gifted education policy. This applies to the state sector. We also have the Catholic sector. So we've got schools divided into 3 sectors. The Catholic sector, each individual sector will have their own policy, and also the independent school, the private schools, that's really dependent on individual schools. And as I said, there are multiple versions of the Francois Gagne differentiated model of giftedness and talent. The 2009 version is the one that's widely adopted. Next, I'll go on to some of the prevailing attitudes toward gifted education in Australia. There are generally mixed attitudes toward gifted students and gifted education. On the one hand, there's apathy and opposition, and this is because of egalitarian values, a belief that everyone should be treated the same, a belief that children of a particular age should all get the same types of educational provisions, a belief that gifted education should be an optional extra, and that priority should be given to students who are having difficulties, who have disabilities, etc. The one exception is giftedness in sport. Sport is an area where there is wide acceptance, a lot of positive attitudes. At the same time, though, there are also some members of the community who have very positive attitudes toward gifted students and gifted education. Number one, because of the political rhetoric about fostering knowledge and creativity for the knowledge economy. Also, a recognition that gifted students have a major role to play in enhancing the country's international competitiveness. Okay, so that's a little bit about the attitudes toward gifted students and gifted education. I'll now go through a brief history of gifted education in Australia. Provisions for gifted students actually existed in Australia since the 19th century. And this is because back then, grade advancement, moving between one grade to the next, it was not dependent on your age, but more on your achievements. It was more based on your academic attainments. So students who made it to secondary school, they tended to be the gifted students. Back then, students who were not gifted tended not to go to secondary school. So there was no real need for gifted education back then. If you were gifted, you went to secondary school, you went to university, etc. Something called opportunity classes were created in elementary schools, primary schools in 1932, and these are ability grouped classes. Gifted classes within primary schools, elementary schools for years 5 and 6. And this started in the state of New South Wales in 1932. And then in 1985, the federal government, the national government, they appointed a Senate committee to do a review of gifted education practices in the country. And they found that there was generally a lack of provisions for gifted students in most schools. The quality of the gifted education offerings was pretty low. And also, many gifted students were not achieving to their potential. As a result, a number of changes were implemented in the country. For example, the Australian Gifted Association, that was launched in the early 90s. The Australasian Journal of Gifted Education, that was started in the early 90s as well. So things started changing in the early 1990s. Then in 2001, there was a second federal Senate inquiry about gifted education in Australia. And they found virtually the same findings as in 1985. this time they introduced a set of recommendations. Number one, need for teachers to get professional development training in gifted education. Number two, a need for all gifted students to be formally identified. There was no real formal identification process. And then also a need for greater funding devoted to gifted education, and also more extensive provisions in gifted education. So some of the previous speakers spoke about acceleration. So in Australia, some of the things that are done are not only grade skipping, but early entry into school, early entry into kindergarten, early entry into university. Ability grouping happens quite a lot. So special classes for gifted students, special schools for gifted students. So in the state of New South Wales, there are about 50 gifted schools in the public sector. The other states, they have gifted schools, but they tend to be fewer in number. So in Victoria, there's about 4 gifted schools. In Queensland, about 3, etc. In terms of the identification of gifted students, most schools that do identify gifted students tend to follow a multiple criteria identification process. A variety of information sources tend to be used. And some of these include things like IQ tests, teacher nominations, achievement tests, etc. But unfortunately, there's some lack of consistency in the identification instruments that are used. Whether the instruments are used concurrently or sequentially. So some of the latest research suggests it's better to have a concurrent process of identification, identifying all students using multiple instruments that are administered at the same time, rather than having a multi-stage process which can exclude a number of gifted students if a particular instrument, if gifted students are not responsive to instruments used in the first stage. Okay, the most commonly used are intelligence tests. So for example, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, that's a psychologist-administered IQ test. Also some group tests like the COGAT, the Cognitive Abilities Test, that's commonly used. Australia is a multicultural country. Many students don't have English as a first language. And to identify these students, non-verbal ability tests are used. For example, the Raven's progressive matrices or the Naglieri non-verbal ability test. And among the subjective instruments, teacher nominations are most commonly used. To identify gifted students from rural areas, what's done is there are multiple opportunity classes, special classes for gifted students in rural areas. Also, there's a virtual selective school, a virtual gifted school that's offered in some states, particularly in New South Wales. Okay, and going to the legal support for gifted education, in New South Wales there's the Education Act 1990, which recognises a duty to ensure that every child receives an education of the highest quality. I guess the second item is particularly relevant to gifted education, a legal requirement for every child to achieve to his or her potential, and also a legal requirement for every child with special abilities to be offered special support. There's also federal law across all the states and territories that prohibits discrimination on the basis of age, sex, disability, and race. Now, of these four criteria that prohibits discrimination, there's a famous court case in Australia of a family who sued the state government for its refusal to allow a gifted student to be accelerated, to be moved up a year, on the basis of, this was seen as age discrimination. There's a famous court case in Australia. Unfortunately, the courts ruled in the favour of the state government. They said that the student was not socially, emotionally ready. So that's unfortunate, but that was that's what actually happened in Australia. So I'll conclude with the SWOT analysis, an analysis of the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats in Australia with respect to gifted education. So one strength is the existence of policy support. So the public sector, there's a state gifted education policy. Most Catholic schools, they have a gifted education policy. Some independent schools, some private schools have a gifted education policy. Also, the Australian professional standards for teachers, the standards by which all teachers are expected to work under, they recognise gifted students. For example, all teachers in Australia are required to follow this standard, 1.5. All teachers are required to differentiate teaching in Australia to meet the needs of students across the full range of abilities. So this includes gifted students. So weaknesses. So there's no requirement for teacher training programs, university programs that train teachers to include gifted education. So some universities will do it voluntarily, however. Also, there's a lack of special funding devoted to gifted education, which contrasts with special education. There's a lot of funding devoted to special education, but not gifted education. Some opportunities. So there's obviously a national concern about promoting the country's competitiveness. There's support from the organisation that's responsible for the national curriculum. There's support from select politicians. So, for example, the state education minister from the state I'm from, she said that all public schools in Australia, this was just last year, all public schools in Australia need to provide for gifted students. Also, there's now more sophisticated research in gifted education than has ever been the case, which means that a lot of the practices that are promoted in the research is a lot more evidence-based, more likely to be effective. And finally, some threats. So egalitarian community attitudes, the idea that everyone is equal. Also, there's a lot of areas of education that have competing priorities. So because teachers have only so many hours to work with students, if there is another priority, for example, at the moment some priorities are educating Indigenous students, English as a second language students. These are often given priority over gifted education. And just a final note, the general practices relating to gifted education are more in line with the research, more in line with the recommendations than has ever been the case, but there is still room for improvement. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Yes, any questions for Professor Jae?
None?
We'll give you two because of the technical difficulties.
Okay.
Thank you for your interesting presentation. I think that we share Australia and Korea, similar situations, problems. I was interested about the trial case that you
Yes.
said it was against the age.
Age discrimination.
So I noticed it was in the 90s,
That was 2006. That was a famous
2006,
case in
okay.
2006.
So that's about 20 years ago.
20 years ago.
Was there any difference after that?
So there's only been one sort of similar case, that one. So because of the changing sort of times, changing attitudes, changing sort of research, I'm sure that there is a possibility for a different outcome in a similar future case.
Well, you don't need to go to court, right? So do you have any policy on acceleration then?
Yes, we've got policy
Yeah.
on acceleration. So we've got extensive guidelines, but these are guidelines only. They're not mandated. So earlier in the presentation, I talked about the legal requirements. There's a legal responsibility to allow all students to reach their full potential. So if you follow that strictly, of course, there's an expectation that students need to be accelerated. And there are guidelines on this is how to do acceleration, etc. Unfortunately, it's not enforced. So you're meant to do this, but it's not being done. That's sort of the issue we're facing.
In practice, it's safe to say that you don't have acceleration in your schools at the moment happening.
We have acceleration, but it's not happening with all the gifted students. That's the problem. So it depends on which school you're at, depends on the attitudes of the leadership at the school, depends on the gifted education coordinator at the school. So it is happening quite a lot, but it's not happening for every student. And that's why we have these court cases every now and then in those situations where the school is not cooperating. And in those situations, I just recommend that they change schools to a school that is more comfortable with acceleration.
Okay, so I see another similarity between our countries. Okay, thank you.
We'll take one more question.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you for a very inspiring presentation. I think we have a similar situation when it comes to competition for resources. Gifted education in Saudi Arabia has received a lot of attention. Also, special education needs have also received a lot of attention. But currently, we notice a shift in the country from gifted to special education needs. There is more attention to that, and less resources are given to gifted education. I'll cite one example for that. Government is now encouraging the construction operation of special education needs on a wider scale. So you will have from the single disabilities to the multiple to the very complicated ones in one location. But there is no plan for science and math academies, for example. So in a situation like that, do you have something like this?
Yes, so we've got. So I'll just tell you some things that demonstrate the focus on special education as opposed to gifted education. I told you during my presentation that there's no requirement for pre-service teachers to get any training in gifted education. But in the state that I'm from, New South Wales, since 1990, so it's more than, it's about 35 years, all pre-service teachers in the state have been required to get training in special education. So that's one big difference. The second big difference is that there's a lot of grant funding, a lot of state and federal level funding for students with disabilities. And of course, students with disabilities need to be supported. But just the contrast with the lack of support with gifted education, it's just alarming. It's very concerning. And it seems that the situation is almost identical in Saudi Arabia. My suggestion is talk to the major newspapers, talk to the politicians. I often get contacted by journalists from some of the Australian newspapers, like the Sydney Morning Herald, for my comments, and I always make a point of raising this, reminding people about this inequality. And the inequality not only extends to it's not only between gifted education and special education. It's also between the different domains of giftedness. So there's a lot of support for giftedness in sport. Australia is a very strong sporting nation, and that's probably reflective of the amount of public support for gifted sportsmen. But if you compare Australia's Olympic gold medals with the number of Australian Nobel Prize winners, it's a stark contrast, and that just reflects the different priorities, the different community attitudes to these two domains. One encouraging development, however, in New South Wales, where I'm from, is that the state education minister, she has said that all public schools will now have a focus on gifted education. And related to that, in May of this year, every public school will get a professional development day in gifted education. So the state government has provided some online gifted education resources. Every public school in one day in May will be required to get teacher training in gifted education. So this is a really exciting development. Unfortunately, it's just for one state in Australia, and also it's not sort of, there's no promise that this will continue. It's not every year we will have training in gifted education. But if we have some support from the key politicians in the education portfolios, I think that will also be a factor that we can consider in the future.
Thank you so much.